The Somerville Lecture was established by the Catholic Register to honor the memory and the essential contributions of Henry Somerville to the early history of the Catholic Register and the furthering of the mission of the Catholic press in Canada. On your way in, you, I'm sure, noticed a table at the back with copies of the Catholic Register on it. Those copies are free for your taking. They're the most recent issue, so please help yourself and take a copy with you on your way home this evening. In light of those general observations, it seems to me only proper that I ask the editor and the publisher of the Catholic Register to introduce to you tonight's lecturer, Father Ron Rolheiser, whom we are very pleased has joined us tonight. So, Joe?
Thank you, Doug. It's a great privilege to be able to introduce Ron Rolheiser tonight. But before I get to that, I would like to take 2 minutes to do two little things. Actually, not little things, big things, I think. First of all, I would like to thank the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience for joining us and working with us to organize this and providing the hospitality for this lecture. It's a great privilege to be part of this whole lecture series. You probably already know this. I'm sure you've heard it before. This center here is a great gem. In the course of my work with the Catholic Register, I go to quite a few different church-related undertakings, and everywhere I go, I hear and see evidence of a great hunger for a place where we can gather clergy, vowed religious, lay people together in a room to discuss in an adult, frank, and respectful way many of these issues facing our church and our world. This is exactly what happens here. It's a valuable contribution to the development of the church in Canada. If you haven't heard that before, I'm saying it tonight anyway. I just am so grateful that we can do this together. Secondly, a little bit about why we are doing this lecture, why we sponsor it. It's Christianity and Communications. In our paper over the last number of years, we have tried to tackle a number of these kinds of issues that we're dealing with. We have tried to bring to our pages a number of people who write about these things, including our own Father Ron Rolheiser tonight. We thought a couple years ago that it would be very helpful to be able to share this beyond our own readership with both Catholics, who are not among our readers yet, and also many non-Catholics who are also just as interested, and in that way create a greater debate about these things. So we decided to sponsor this lecture here and in Toronto, and we've named it after Henry Somerville. Now, if you're like me, you don't know who Henry Somerville is. I didn't know who he was until I started at the Register in 1995, but he has had a highly influential impact on the development of the church in Canada. He was the editor of the Register for 20 years, from 33 to 53, during a tumultuous time in the history of this country and also in the history of the church. He was a staunch advocate of the social teachings of the church at a time when very few people were, and a very strong advocate for workers' rights and for the education of the average lay person so they could take on their proper role as apostles of the church. Now I get a chance to introduce Father Ron Rolheiser. The easy way to start with any introduction, I suppose, is to turn to someone's CV. And in that way you get the bare bone details of someone's life. So we have here Father Ron Rolheiser, Roman Catholic priest, General Councillor for Canada for his order, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He's known across Canada, United States, Great Britain, Ireland, and New Zealand as a popular and highly respected columnist on spirituality, and his column is in 40 newspapers to date, including the Catholic Register. He's also author of a number of books on spirituality, many of which you would see out there tonight on the table. Many of these have found their way onto the top 10 bestseller lists for Catholic books. These include his most recent book, Against an Infinite Horizon, which was published in 2001, and others, such as The Holy Longing, from 1999, and The Shattered Lantern, from 1995. Father Rolheiser hails from rural Saskatchewan and has been a priest for more than 26 years. He received his doctorate from the University of Louvain, Belgium, in 1983, and specializes in a surprisingly wide range of subjects, including systematic theology, world religions, Christian anthropology, philosophy, mysticism, and contemporary spirituality. Also, though many of us know him and appreciate him for his writing, he has taught many, many students over the years through classes in theology and philosophy at the Newman Theological College in Edmonton, Alberta, and he is also an adjunct faculty member at Seattle University in Washington. Well, that's the CV. But I know a little more about him as an editor. I have been his editor at the Catholic Register for the last 7 years. And yet, it's interesting that this week has been the first time we have been able to spend more than 5 minutes talking to each other. We both, I guess, have very busy lives, his in particular. In that sense, I guess ours has been a rather lopsided relationship. He knows very little about me. But I've had the opportunity each week to get to know a little more about him. When I read his columns before they go in the paper, which is one of the few perks I have, I come to understand more about those subjects that he feels passionate about. I get an insight into what he likes to read, where he receives his own inspiration. I know what he thinks and why about our church, about our faith. More importantly, though, when I read his columns, I hear his voice. It is soft and gentle, yet compelling and passionate. It is a voice of someone who has, in his own life, struggled with the same demons we all face, and has thought about these struggles deeply. He has asked himself the same questions that we all ask ourselves. Yet, in his writing, he shares what he has found in ways that we can understand and connect with our own lives. This is a gift, and it's not given to every journalist. Believe me, I'm green with envy. It's true, communicating by words alone is something many of us do in our lives, especially with email these days. We are constantly writing memos back and forth to each other, letters, that sort of things. But to communicate passion and understanding, thoughtfulness, and a deep longing for God, using only black ink on paper, that is no mean feat. If you think about it, it is like talking in a monotone to an audience that is blindfolded. Your smiles, your frowns, the uplifted eyebrows, eye contact are useless. Your body language is meaningless. All those ways we communicate so much when we talk to each other are silenced. The writer is left only with words. Great writers rise above these handicaps to convey whole worlds of meaning with only those symbols on paper. I think you will agree with me after tonight that Father Ron Rolheiser is among them. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Father Ron.
First question always, can everybody hear this? Sounds clear. First of all, I want to thank Joe Senesek and the Catholic Register for organizing this. That poor man has to hear me twice in the same week. He'll have less purgatory. I want to thank St. Jerome's and Doug Ledson for hosting this event. And especially I want to thank all of you for coming out on a snowy Friday night when there's many other distractions. And you come to hear something about religion and the church. You'll also have less time in purgatory. Since the topic tonight is it's a heavy topic, and it's just a heavy topic, I'll start a little lighter, just some little church stories and so on, just to lighten it a little bit before it gets really heavy and nasty. It's a story told of a missionary. I belong to a missionary order, and the story told of one of our missionaries. And he was working in the dark jungles of Africa. And he was taken sick with quite a serious illness. And so our order, we flew him back to Canada, and they put this man into a very good hospital. And the first morning, the doctor came into his room, and the doctor was completely in white. White cap, white mask, all you could see was the eyes, white smock, white gloves, white shoes. And the doctor said to him, he said, "Now, Father, you have contracted a very serious and a very contagious tropical disease, and you're to be quarantined for 4 months on a diet of pizza and pancakes." And the priest looked at the doctor and he said, "Pizza and pancakes?" He said, "Is that food to make one better?" The doctor said, "We don't know, but it's all we'll be able to slide under the door." Little story told too of were several women. They were from different denominations, and they had a little prayer group together, and they were lamenting about declining church attendance in their various congregations. And the one woman said, "You know, in our congregation, it is so bad. On a given Sunday, there are less than 50 people in church." And the second woman said, "In our congregation, it's so bad. On a given Sunday, there's less than 20 people in church." And the third woman said, "In our congregation, it's so bad that on a given Sunday, when the reverend says, 'Dearly beloved,' I blush." Finally, a little story where two American monks, they were walking along one Saturday morning. In the United States, they have these lotto jackpots, and they get really high, like sometimes they're up to $40 or $50 million on a draw on their 649. So these two monks are walking along, and they see the lotto jackpot, which is $46 million. And the one monk got very excited and said, "We have to stop at a convenience store on the way home, and I want to buy 2 tickets because the draw is tonight, and the jackpot is $46 million. And the second monk said, "Why? Why would you want to win $46 million? He says, "You're a monk. You have a vow of poverty. What would you do if you won $46 million? And the first monk said, "Discernment, a lot of discernment." Okay, our topic tonight, I'm glad you laughed now. Okay, carrying a scandal biblically. And I want to begin with an apology, even though that's not a good way to begin a talk. I want to apologize because this is a topic that it's impossible to talk about without upsetting at least some people. See, there are at least 5 or 6 separate kinds of anger that surround this. You know, so very simply put, that, you know, in this issue, you have victims angry at perpetrators, and they should be. You have priests angry at their bishops. You can decide whether they should be. You have bishops angry at the press. You have Catholics angry at the hierarchy in the church who feel betrayed. You have a lot of church people who are angry, but they're not sure who to be angry at. And by the time I'm finished tonight, I suspect some of you will be very angry at me. Okay. You know, there's about 5 or 6 different kinds of anger. It's not just one anger that's being shared by a lot of groups. This is 5 or 6 discrete kinds of anger around the same issue. So it's a landmine to try to walk around in there. And I think one of the ways we've handled it is simply that we haven't talked about it. And there hasn't been a lot of public forum. There hasn't been a lot of openness on the issue because it's just too painful and too loaded with landmines to talk about. I was hoping there'd be a back door out of here because I'm not sure where this will end. But I want to do 3 things with you tonight, briefly in the time we have before. I want to talk a little bit about simply the crisis itself that this has provoked, particularly in the American church. And then also briefly, a little bit about the background of sexual abuse. Because it's in a scandal about sexual abuse, there's a lot of non-understanding and under-understanding about the issue of sexual abuse and what it is. But on the main part of the talk, I want to talk precisely about how to carry a scandal biblically. If there were a subtitle for this talk, I'd call it this way: From being scandalized to helping to carry a scandal biblically. It's one thing to be scandalized, it's another thing to help carry a scandal and to carry it in a biblical way. I hope you all have a one-page handout or access to one, and I'm going to roughly follow that so you'll know where I am and when I should be finished. Okay. First of all, just a little bit about the scandal itself and the revelation side of the church. I want to begin by saying that this is a major crisis for a young church. Emphasis on both, the major crisis and the youth of our church. I think it's an important perspective to situate this. Particularly in the United States, the scandal has hit somewhat differently in Canada because we've had this in pieces for really 15 years. And our press is a different kind of beast than the press in the United States. I don't even mean beast in a pejorative sense. The Canadian press tends to operate very differently. CBC is not CNN, as you know. And thank goodness for that. My own bias. Okay. But in the United States particularly, and to an extent in Canada, this is a major crisis. And it's a crisis that also should be named carefully. This is not a crisis of faith, you know. And they've done surveys on that, so I'm not just speaking off the top of my head, although I'll do enough of that tonight too. Okay. It's not a crisis of faith, but surveys have shown it's not that Catholics or Christians are stopping to believe, or it's casting doubt on the resurrection or the existence of God, or even on the church itself. But it's a crisis of trust. And it's a crisis of credibility. And especially that first word, trust, can never be underrated. You know, we have to base our life, like when we talk about love and fidelity and key things, they got to be based on trust. And when trust breaks down, it doesn't matter sometimes much what you believe. When trust has broken down, something very basic breaks down. Oftentimes people divorce in a marriage if trust breaks down. So this is a crisis of trust that impacts, you know, priests to bishops, church to priests, so on. And it's a major crisis. It's a big one for a young church. See, our churches in North America are young churches. You know, Judeo-Christianity, the two together, have been around for about 4,000 years. We're very young churches, particularly as Catholics in North America. You know, we're 100, 200 at maximum. French Canadians and some of the Catholic churches are about 300 years old. That's relatively young. And for most part of that history, it's been a history of growth. And it's been a wonderful history, you know. So that the churches here, the Catholic Church particularly, came into North America with the immigrants. And they came with the poor, and they rose up, and they had a tremendous and valued place inside of the community. And still does, the church, to a major extent. And so it's a young church, and certainly for the United States, perhaps less so for Canada. This is the biggest crisis American Catholicism has yet faced. But we're young. We're a young church. Then, as I say, secondly, it's a dark night of the soul that aims at the Achilles heel. It's very important to name some of these things to situate them. Richard Rohr, who's one of my favorite theologians, Richard always says, not everything can be fixed and cured, but it should be named properly. It's important to name this. And as I want to say later on, this is a dark night of the soul. That's the mystical term. The scripture would use things like an agony in the garden. It's a Gethsemane experience. It's the same thing, it's just a biblical term. But we'll see later on, it's very important to name that because those are always grace opportunities. This is not a terrible time for the church. This is not a horrible time for the church. This is a very painful time for the church, but it's a good time. This is a good time. I want to say later on, when Jesus talked about, you know, his own experience in the agony in the garden, he says, wasn't it necessary that this happen? You know, this is going to see, this is an important time for the church and for the world and the community and so on. But it's interesting when you study mysticism and the literature of mysticism, you'll see that invariably dark nights of the soul, they always hit you at the Achilles heel. It's where you don't expect it, and where it's going to hurt the most, and where you're the most vulnerable, and that's where it hits. So it's not surprising it would hit on the issue of sexuality, the issue of trust, the issue of betrayal at those levels, that this would be the church's crises. You know, crucifixions always look real messy, always. The first one did, and they always look shameful, and the ones that follow always do too. Okay, that's a little bit about just the revelations. Now, secondly, the need to carry this biblically, we'll look at that. A little important background, and I'll try to do this in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, so we have the last 25 minutes just to talk about how to carry the scandal. But it's important that we contextualize this thing properly. I just find that so many discussions about this begin at about, if you were doing the alphabet, they begin about the letter U or the letter W. We got to begin with A, B, C, D, you know. You know, if you come into a film, and, you know, the film is 3/4 over, it's pretty hard to get a real sense of the story. Let's spin this film right back to the beginning. And it's important to look at, okay, this was provoked by accusations, allegations, some real, some not, but many real, of priests sexually abusing children. A scandal in which rocked the church to its roots. Okay, let's look at that. I want to put a little bit of very important background to the whole issue of sexual abuse in the culture and then on to the church, because it contextualizes it. Doesn't excuse it, it contextualizes it. Okay. Now, first point I say, some painful, stunning numbers. And I wish there'd be some easy, gentle way of putting this. There isn't. I bring this up because the issue of sexual abuse, as I want to say later on, it's an issue in the church, but the church is just one small decimal fraction part of this. See, the statistics I've seen, which we have for North America, we don't have them for the rest of the world, but I suspect they'd probably be roughly parallel. But in North America, they estimate today that 1 out of every 4th or 5th person who comes to adulthood, boy, girl, or boy, has somehow been sexually violated as a child, in some major form or some minor form. 1 out of every 4 or 5, like 20 to 25%, which when you graph that out in terms of an image, it means in every 4th or 5th house in all of North America, there is something happening that shouldn't happen. And interestingly enough, not that we should say this and try to be defensive, actually sexual abuse is statistically lower among clergy than among the population at large. I think in fairness that also needs to be said. Now, secondly, the abuse of children at the level of pedophilia, not the second level, which is epiphilia. I can't have trouble pronouncing that word, you know. That is a disease, as I'll talk about. It's a sickness. It's not a question of willpower. It's a question of a disease, and it's also a question that plays no favorites, like alcoholism. It's not a celibate disease or a married disease, a gay disease or a straight disease. It's a disease that cuts across all denominated lines. Clergy and lay, married and celibate, man and women, straight and gay, rich and poor. This isn't some place you can just isolate and say, here it is. You know, it's important to know that you're dealing with a disease that's indiscriminate. It doesn't play favorites. Okay, now, the nature. Just a little bit about the nature of the disease of pedophilia. And if you want to discuss this afterwards, I invite questions. It's a disease, a pathology, a clinical pathology, and in fact, a very severe one. And so it's not a question of willpower or somebody acting out or somebody choosing to become that, you know. It's a disease. It's not a, you know, we used to think like that about alcoholism. 60 or 70 years ago, our naivete, that's not that long ago, we had a naivete about things like alcohol or something where we just felt it was a question of willpower. Why doesn't this guy just stop drinking? And if he said he's going to stop drinking very sincerely, we believed him. Today we know that's tremendously naive. This is an illness. And an alcoholic can say 1,000,000 times with both hands and feet on the Bible, I will never drink again, and unless he gets the right kind of help, he's going to drink again. Pedophilia, the same thing. Okay, it's a disease. And now, a couple of things about its nature. It's caused, the literature used to be kind of univocal until about 1996, 97, it began to split, although it still agrees on some of the very basics. But the literature would agree, the clinical literature, that it's always caused by some massive trauma in childhood. It's caused by some massive trauma in childhood, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes by sexual abuse itself. So that in many cases, not all cases, in fact, they used to say all the cases. Now some psychiatrists still say that, some have backed off, But they used to say every abuser was first abused, which doesn't mean everybody who's abused abuses, but every abuser was first abused. That used to be a clinical axiom. Now they've backed off from it, but they'll still say whatever caused it was something massive in terms of trauma, because it's like a shock. If you get a car accident, your body goes into shock, where in fact the body and the psyche are still largely in shock. It was caused by some massive trauma, which is part of what the person acts out in the anatomy of the disease. And the disease, but the reason why they say it was something massively traumatic is because it's buried so deeply, which is also why most of the time, in almost all cases, they can't cure it with real pedophilia, because it's buried so deeply that oftentimes the person wasn't even aware that it happened to him or her, and sadly, oftentimes when they act out, they also, at a certain level, are not even aware that they're doing this. I've seen pedophiles pass 2 lie detector tests back to back, and they were lying. They didn't know they were lying. The trauma in their own youth, which did something to the child inside of them, which is also part of the anatomy of the disease. See, pedophilia is a disease in which an adult, post-puberty, is pathologically attracted to a child who's pre-puberty. Okay, and that's unnatural. Naturally, people who are healthy and have reached natural sexual and adult development are in no way interested sexually in a child who's pre-puberty. Why somebody is a pedophile, it has to do with traumas in their own childhood, and simplistically put, for sake of just huge things in a few minutes, the itch isn't even so much for sexuality as it is for their own lost child, which is somehow taken from them in whatever their personal trauma is. So that's part of the nature of the disease. It's also, to put this rather simply but clearly, it has an utter devastation of its victim. It is impossible, and I can say this categorically, it's impossible to exaggerate the effect that sexual abuse has on its victim, even when it seems minor. And when it isn't minor, most of the time the best way of putting it, it's an utter devastation of soul. It's an utter unraveling of the soul. There is no psychic form of violence that approximates sexual abuse. And that's not an exaggeration. There is no psychic violence you can do to somebody that, physical violence, hitting somebody, which is itself really violent, doesn't do this. It leaves, essentially, quotation marks, an incurable wound. I want to throw this out. Sometimes people get really startled when I say this. And I've heard that from 2 different psychiatrists who will, we don't have research in this, and there's no way we can get full research, as you'll see from the nature of the cases. But I've heard 2 different, very good respective psychiatrists say that teenage suicide, in 80% of teenage suicides, one guy even says 90, this is the issue. The issue is sexual abuse. Also in the suicides of many adults. The devastation to soul is that, and that's why we can never make light of this. Okay, that's the devastation of soul. Then a little bit about the needs of the victims. I'm just going to list them. I've worked on both sides of this equation. I was a provincial once. I've worked with priests who were pedophiles. I've worked with victims and victims groups. And the victims will tell you what they want from the authorities in the church and elsewhere. Society is always an honest acknowledgement that somebody else is sick. And until they get that, oftentimes they end up carrying the sickness. Then they also want compassion rather than legal hardball. They want healing, and especially, very importantly, is an acceptance of their anger. 3 different times, I didn't get a chance tonight or Wednesday, before I'd give this kind of talk, I would phone about 3 victims that I've worked with. And I said, I'm talking to a group tonight, sexual abuse, what should I say? And every one of the 3 said, tell them not to be afraid of our anger. We got to be angry. We need this. Tell them not to be afraid of that, and so on. So, very important, not to be afraid of the anger that's attached around this. Now, that's a little background to the issue. So what we're talking about here is a massive problem inside of the culture, which now, for all kinds of reasons, has constellated and crystallized in the front pages of the newspapers about the church and its clergy, inside of Roman Catholicism, but also inside of Anglicanism and United Church and elsewhere, and so on. So, see, that's kind of setting the stage. We have a massive social problem, cultural problem, with massive ramifications. So that if 1 out of every 4 or 5 kids comes to adulthood unwhole, sexually violated, and these are, the devastation, varies according to the degree of, the trauma and so on. We have this massive thing, but it's crystallized, it's constellated, not in society as a whole yet. It's constellated on the front pages of the newspapers about the Roman Catholic Church, its clergy, and its hierarchy, with a very specific focus on that. What's to be said about that? Okay. And then we're saying, and this is causing this huge, kind of vacuum of trust that's happening, a huge erosion of trust. Now, it's going to cause that, certainly. What about us in this room tonight? And I'm not sure who you are or why you came here or what your commitment is to Christianity or to faith or to adulthood as a woman or a man. But what's the adult response, particularly the Christian response? Well, I could come at this through anthropology and other ways. I want to come at tonight just through Scripture. I hope I don't sound fundamentalistic, but I want to try to be biblical, because that's what the title is called. To carry a scandal biblically. How do we do that? How do we do that? I was going to give you a text. If there's time, I'll give it at the end rather than at the beginning, the text from Tobit. If you're curious what that text is, that's the text about Tobit getting shit in his eye and going blind, which is a very apt metaphor for what's happening here. The church suddenly has a whole lot of shit in its eye. And remember, Tobit went blind, but remember that story. It's also not a bad story. It's the beginning of his spirituality, not the end of his spirituality at all. Okay, how do we carry a scandal biblically? There's 10 elements to it, really 9. Just to, like the opera, you have the overture at the beginning. First of all, always by trying to radiate the compassion of Christ. Now notice compassion, it's an interesting word. See, if I'm radiating indignation, I'm radiating anger, all of those are very valid, and there can be a certain amount of compassion and so on in that, but our primary task as adults, as women, as men, as Christians, is to radiate in a situation like that the compassion of Christ and the understanding of Christ, and in 2 ways. First of all, in a privileged way, always towards the victim. The first focus of every discussion on this always has to be the victim. Who was hurt? See, that's where the cross of Christ moves. It always moves to the excluded one, the one who's been victimized, the one who's innocent. Even if they're not innocent, they're structurally innocent, the one who got hurt. That's the first thing. But then Christian compassion doesn't stop there. Then Christian compassion has to also move out, and this is where the difficulty comes in. Compassion also has to move out to the perpetrator. That's going to be part of the new song, as I want to talk about later, that we're asked to sing. To the perpetrator, because the perpetrator is also ill. It's a sickness. Sickness can cause evil, but this is a person who's ill, who he himself or herself was first of all massively violated some way too as a child. And somebody once said, in fact René Girard puts that in his famous books on anthropology, says that it seems like the final triumph archetypally of evil is when the victim becomes the victimizer. You know, we're hurt, and then we begin to hurt other people, you know. But see, our sympathy has to go to the victim in a privileged way, and then it has to go to the victimizer as well, the perpetrator, because that person, man or woman, is carrying the least glamorous of all illnesses. You know, no sickness is pretty, as they say in Texas. It ain't pretty. You know, there's no illness that looks nice, except in Hollywood screens, you know, where somebody's dying of cancer and they look like $1 million. When you visit hospitals, you see people die of cancer, they don't look like $1 million at all. There is no illness, physical, emotional, or anything that looks glamorous. But the least glamorous, especially the least morally glamorous of all illnesses, is the sickness of the pedophile, you know. And that is the new leper that everybody is afraid to touch. Remember, Francis of Assisi's great conversion came when he found himself capable of touching the leper. You want to think about that one. You really want to think about that one. His conversion came when he was capable of touching the leper. The biggest outcast leper in the entire world today, the Western world, is the pedophile. And I'm not just talking about priests who are just less than 0.01% of pedophiles in our culture. They're in prisons. They're all over the place. Now, that's not to say we don't treat them and remove them so they can't do this incalculable damage they do. It's a sickness. Okay. So the first thing is our compassion. To radiate the compassion, the understanding of Christ. Secondly, that our first movement is always towards healing and not towards self-protection and security. See, so that the church, especially this is more particular for the hierarchy, but also for all of us. You know, when these issues come up, for instance, I'm a priest. My natural instinct, I'm a priest and I love the church. My natural instinct is to protect, you know, to deny or to whatever, in whatever way, rationalize, justify. No. Healing is what's at issue here. And I'm going to say later on, not particularly even healing for the church. The church is secondary, always. The church exists for the culture, not the other way around. So our first movement always has to be healing and not self-protection. Fourthly, that we have to see this, and sometimes I really get in trouble when I say this, but it's so important. This now becomes one of perhaps, but certainly one of the primary ministries inside of the church. This is not a distraction to what the church is about. Let me give you a quick quote here. Henri Nouwen, speaking in a very different context, Henry used to say, I used to be so upset, he said, about distractions and interruptions in my work until I realized that the distractions and interruptions were the real work. See, this is not a distraction or an interruption to the work of the church today. It is the work of the church today. You know, I hear bishops and I hear provincials and I hear Christians say, it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it will. And it's going to drain off so much human resources and money, and it's a distraction. We could be running RCA programs and doing all this other stuff. Now we're caught up in court systems, litigation, this and stuff, scandal, money, ruined personnel. What a distraction to the life of the church. No. This is the real work of the church today. You know, it's very unglamorous work. I'll get to that later. The crucifixion was a particularly unglamorous moment inside of Christendom, but it's also the foundation of Christendom. This is not a distraction. This is not a bleeding off of resources. This is the real work of the church, okay? And later on I'm going to see why. So let me introduce that. Because this is something the church today is being asked to do for the culture. Let me first talk about the church and the culture and then try to pinpoint this work. Why do I say this? I think one of the major misconceptions and misreadings of Scripture, or this is biblical, that we have is how we define Jesus and then later on define the church and its role. Let's begin with Jesus. Jesus was real clear. Jesus said, "My flesh is food for the life of the world." Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "My flesh is food for the life of the church." My flesh is food for the life of the world. Jesus says, I came to be eaten by the world, literally. And that's why there's tremendous symbolism in his birth. Jesus was born in a trough where animals feed. We call it kind of euphemistically a manger. Jesus was born in a manger. I grew up on a farm. We call a manger a trough. That's where animals come to eat. It's no accident Jesus was born where animals eat, and he ended up on a table, which we call the altar, to be eaten again. See, Jesus says, I came into the world to be eaten up, not by the church. I came to be eaten up by the world. My flesh is food for the life of the world. Give you a quick kind of a contrast on how subtle but how important. I remember hearing a radio interview once with a major cardinal in a North American city. Nice man, but a frightened man. And this journalist, the woman journalist, said to him, she says, Your Eminence, she says, what do you think is your first task as a prelate in the church in this culture today? Very sincere man, he says, to defend the faith. Sounds noble. I remember hearing Cardinal Hume, Basil Hume in England, asked the same question in Louvain in 1985. Someone said to him, what's the first thing the church needs to do for the world? What's the church's agenda? Hume said, to save the planet. Notice the difference? To defend the church, to save the planet. See, Jesus came to save the planet. The church exists for the world, and right now I said, this is the connection I want you to make here. In the world, in the Western culture today, sexual abuse is one of the biggest, hugest human problems in our culture. If 80% of our suicides, especially if the young and many of the old, tell you how deep this problem is. Okay. But it's constellated, not in culture as a whole yet. Right now the church is on the front pages, and its clergy and its bishops, and sometimes right up to the Pope. Okay. So what is our job as church, as clergy, bishops, Pope? Is not to get defensive and to defend the faith. We're meant to become food for the life of the planet, which means to carry this in such a way that it helps the world come to grips with this. That's the deep part. If you miss everything else I say tonight, if you disagree with everything else, and so you can disagree with this, but remember that. Our whole task, we're given a mission in this. That's why it's not a distraction to the real work of the church. We're being asked to do something for the world. And that is to carry this as a church in such a way that there's fruit. That somehow the planet, that when all this blows over, and Lord knows when it's going to blow over, when it all blows over, kids are safer in this country unless people get violated and so on. And if the church needs to be scapegoated for a while, and it's not that we didn't do anything wrong, then so be it. It may well be worth, it will be worth the price. Jesus didn't enjoy the crucifixion at all. Okay. Now, so with that comes number 5, a great purification and pruning. It's important to see this. See, this is a tremendous humiliation for the church. Is that bad? No. It's real good. That's real good. See, the humiliation hopefully brings us to humility. The word, you see the connection. Humiliation often leads, if it doesn't automatically lead that. It can just as easily lead to bitterness and to a hardened spirit. But when humiliation does its work, properly leads to humility. And do we need humility? Absolutely. As a Catholic community, we need it through and through and through. Because for too long, we have, and the clergy, it's no accident it's focused on the clergy and bishops and so on. For too long, we have enjoyed clerical privilege. We've enjoyed ecclesial privilege in this culture, And we made a mistake doing that, both a biblical mistake, but also a tremendously stupid strategical mistake. Because as Malcolm X, the great black leader, used to say, he said, the chickens always come home to roost. And when you have a time of historical privilege, you can be sure you're going to have a time of historical disprivilege. And that's what we're enjoying right now. We're not enjoying it, but it's doing us a whole lot of good. And apparently we need a whole lot more of it. You know, when you study the biblical thing about wandering in the desert or exile, which are images of humiliation, images of being lost. And you know, being lost is not bad. I love a line from Christina Crawford, the actress, who's incidentally is quite a good Catholic. But Christina Crawford, in her autobiography, she writes at the beginning of one chapter where it's just really a lost time in her life. And she has a quote, or a little line, she says, lost is a place too. Okay. You know, to be in the desert is a good place to be. To be humbled is a good place to be. And how long do we have to stay there? Well, you know, in Scripture they always say you have to either stay 40 days or 40 years. Okay. But in Scripture, 40 days and 40 years, you know, Scripture, 40 means the length of time that it takes. It might be 10 days, it might be 50 years. 40 in Scripture, it's the full number. The length of time it takes. And how long will that be? Well, what it's meant to teach you. You know, and once we get it, it goes. Or once it gets us. You know. See, so we have to stay with the pain long enough that until it teaches us what it's meant to teach us. Pain will never go away. We can deny it, distract it, take drugs, mummify or numbify ourselves against it. It'll always be there like a dog barking at the door until we let it do its work. Pain is meant to teach us something. And when we get it, when we understand what it teaches, it goes away. Apparently there's a lot of stuff in the church we still need to learn. And many have to do with humility, with clerical privilege, with historical dishonesty, with lack of transparency, and on and on. That's an important part for us here. You know, the church is being brought to its knees against its will, so is the hierarchy, against its will to say, and it's God behind it. See, in Dark Nights of the Soul, the mystics always say, God is doing this. We all say, it's the press. No. God is doing that, and God is saying, since you're not going to be humble on your own, we're going to assure that you get humble. And you're going to get real humble, you know. And so the press is doing God's work. I was speaking in Cleveland in April, and it was just a very, very bad time for the Americans. And some from the audience, it wasn't on this topic, but some woman stood up and says, you know, how can journalists go to bed at night and sleep when they're writing all this vicious stuff about the church? I said, no. They're doing us a favor. They are doing us a favor. You know, because until it's not easy to grow. And sometimes we don't grow until we're forced to grow. The church, you know, wasn't going to be transparent until it was made to be transparent. And in that sense, see that the mystics, and even in Scripture, it wasn't the Assyrians that beat Israel. It was always Yahweh. God is behind this. So you carry a biblical scandal biblically always by saying it's God who's driving us. God is the force behind our humiliation. Now, this is a grace opportunity. As I said, it's our agony in the garden. And, you know, it's interesting when Jesus is talking about the agony in the garden to his apostles, later on the road to Emmaus in Luke's Gospel. You know, when he does this agony in the garden, and it's interesting when you read Luke's account, especially of the agony in the garden. Before Jesus goes out to pray, he calls the disciples out. They're coming out of the Last Supper room, and he says, watch me. Watch this. See, the whole idea is, I want to give you a lesson. But they fall asleep. They missed the lesson, you know. And they fell asleep. Very interesting. They didn't fall asleep because they were tired or had drunk too much at the Last Supper. Luke says they fell asleep out of depression. You know, so often our falling asleep to the ways of God in the world are not because we're even inflated or we've drunk too much and inebriated on our culture. We fall asleep because we're all depressed as hell, you know, and then we can't understand. But see, the lesson Jesus gives them the Last Supper and the agony of the garden is the necessity of transformation, the necessity of pain to bring about the new world, the new life. Okay, they missed the lesson. And see, so we need to understand this is a grace opportunity, but we only get the grace if we endure the pain and we don't push it away. Remember, Jesus even tried to push it away. He says, Father, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours. Okay. Then, it's meant to bring us to what Scripture calls to begin to sing a new song. I love that expression in Scripture. And those of you who pray the Psalms, it's in our hymns too, so sing to the Lord a new song. Have you ever wondered what the old one is? Like, if you're supposed to sing a new song, no, you only get the meaning by contrasting it to the old one. What's the old song? Well, the old song is the one we're always, that this kind of comes naturally. And there's many aspects to it. Let me risk it one interpretation. See, we're asked to sing a new song, which means that we come to a new level of compassion. We come to a new level of adulthood. We come to a new level of understanding, a new level of prayer. Let me risk an example which takes it away from here to something else. Take the issue of capital punishment in the world. Okay, I grew up in a very good Catholic family. My mom and dad were saints, and that's not an exaggeration. I can say that today on November the 1st, which is the Feast of All Saints. I drew a very long straw. I had very wonderful parents, but we were taught, as part of our era, to believe in capital punishment. After all, criminals deserve it, and they're murderers. And this is going to be a deterrent, and so on. So it was part of the old song, and the song hasn't changed much. Today, my mom and dad weren't so sophisticated, they couldn't use words like closure. See, today they say we have to kill Timothy McVeigh because that puts closure for the victims' families. Does it? It's part of the old song. No, I think it brings some catharsis to the families. It doesn't bring closure at all. Scripture says only one thing. Only one thing. The New Testament is unambiguous, unequivocal, and crystal clear on this. Only one thing ever brings closure to anything, and it's forgiveness. It's understanding and forgiveness. Everything else delays everything. Only forgiveness brings closure. So take the issue of Timothy McVeigh. The victims' families, some of them, who really wanted to see this man dead. And I sympathize with them emotionally. Emotionally, I favor capital punishment. Because emotionally, that's what we want. You want to see murderers get there. It's like at the end of a movie, you want to see the bad guy get shot, not forgiven. Unless your morals are a lot higher than mine. See, my emotional reaction, you want to see the bad get theirs. See, because that gives you a cathartic feeling. You walk out of the theater and Joe Pesci got shot and you're happy about it, But it doesn't solve anything. In fact, it makes things worse. One of the families that lost a daughter in the Oklahoma bombings, the parents went and visited the parents of Timothy McVeigh, spent different times, went to see him. They prayed together and cried together and talked about how difficult it is today. You think they're closer to closure than the people who are counting down 7, 6, 5, fry the bastard. Who's closer to closure? See, only forgiveness brings closure. One of the new songs we're being asked to, I named at the beginning, no matter where we're in this thing, there's anger. Angry this, angry that, angry that, angry that. And we all say, I have every right to be angry. Yes, absolutely. We always have a right to be angry. The people who, Timothy McVeigh, the families of the victims, they have a right to be angry. But anger is important for a while, and then it's something we're meant to leave, and we're meant to move towards forgiveness. Richard Rohr wrote a very Confederate kind of radical reverse piece on this, biblically. And Rohr says, he said, we have to play the legal game. It's very important. And we have to do it partly to protect society, but biblically it works the opposite of society and legality. See, in our world, which much shapes our consciousness, it works this way. You declare innocence until you're proven guilty. Then you go to court and you're proven guilty and you're given a punishment. Scripturally, it works exactly the opposite. You declare yourself guilty, you're pronounced innocent, and there is no punishment. That's the way Scripture works. You declare, you confess guilt. God declares you innocent, and there is no punishment. Notice that's the complete reversal, psychologically, legally, and everything of our entire system of thinking. And that also applies here. But people say, well, what about the issue? Every issue, whether it's capital punishment, whether it's pedophilia, whatever it is, we're being asked for something new. And the new is forgiveness, a new song, and also a new compassion that already factors in the moral messiness of the issue. Let me risk one other application on this. Well, the whole talk's a risk, but anyway. I have very good Catholic friends who have told me, remember one young lawyer, very good friend of mine, in fact, his brother is one of our priests and one of our finest priests. And he told me, he's a young lawyer with lots of money, he says, the Catholic Church will never get another penny from me, ever. He said, I am not paying money, he said, I'll give money to food banks and so on, but I will not give money because some priest had sex with a kid. Well, what's wrong with that statement? I mean, certainly it's justified emotionally, but notice it's the old song. When you boil that down, it's what Jesus calls the virtue of the scribes and the Pharisees, which is a virtue of strict justice. Where he's saying, I can give money to causes that are clean. I can give money, to a food bank or something, and I'll feel real good about it afterwards. Can I give money to something that's morally messy? For somebody who's sick, and whose illness is so unglamorous? See, that's the new test. What kind of compassion have you got? Remember, Jesus said, and Jesus makes this the orthodoxy test of the New Testament. In the New Testament, the test for orthodoxy is not dogma. Jesus couldn't care whether you believe there's 5 people in the Trinity instead of 3. If your math is bad, it's just you'll have a lot of trouble making the sign of the cross if you got 5 stocks. Okay. Actually, we already got 4. We could easily add 1. Okay. But he also doesn't make the criteria causes, and as important as dogma is and justice is, Jesus doesn't make them the criteria of orthodoxy. What is the test, the litmus test, whether you're a Christian? The capacity to forgive an enemy and to love beyond your own emotionality. Remember Jesus says, anybody can be nice to those who are nice to them. Anybody can forgive people who forgive you. Anybody can bless those who bless you. But can you bless those who curse you? Can you forgive those who won't forgive you? Can you love those who hate you? He said, that's the test. That's the New Testament. That's where it goes beyond anything else. The test is, can you give not in kind? Which brings me to the last point. I'll stop on that. We're asked to carry this tension in the biblical sense of pondering. I was first tempted to just spend the talk on this, which would be the key point, but let me just name this. Then we'll stop and we'll take questions. See, Scripture asks us to ponder, to imitate Mary's pondering. That verb is used only about Mary in the New Testament. Okay? And first of all, it doesn't mean what we normally think it means. See, our mindsets have been formed by Greek philosophy and so on, which I like. But anyway, it's not the software that Mary thought in or Scripture. So, see, pondering for a Greek would be like Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. Where we sit and we think deep thoughts and we journal and so on. That's pondering in a Greek sense. It's not what he meant for a Hebrew. For a Hebrew, when it says Mary pondered these things, pondering meant this, simply as it has in heaven that line. To ponder means to hold, carry, and transform tension so as not to give it back in kind. To hold, carry, and transform tension so as not to give it back in kind. What does that mean? Take an example, which would be an icon. An icon of Mary pondering is Mary under the cross of Jesus. What is she doing there? Overtly nothing. She doesn't speak a word. She's not giving a speaking part under the cross. And notice she isn't doing it. She's not trying to stop the crucifixion. There's no evidence that Mary tried to rip a guy who was nailing Jesus she had to be restrained. But notice she isn't protesting either. Mary isn't under the cross saying, don't get my son mixed up with the other 2 guys. He's innocent, they're guilty. She's not doing anything, it seems, except Scripture said she stood. And standing in Hebrew means she was strong. It's a position of strength. Artists sometimes have Mary prostrate under the cross. Doesn't honor her. They said Mary stood under the cross. She was strong. But what was she doing? She was pondering, which means she was taking in that tension. All that hatred, misunderstanding, darkness and stuff. She was holding it and transforming it so as not to give it back in kind. That's the key thing. See, when I give back tension in kind, I go through life and I'm like an electrical wire. Someone comes up to me and says, you're a wonderful man. I'll say, well, you're wonderful too, and you obviously have good taste. See, it went through me. Okay. Someone comes up and says, I hate you, and I hate you too. See, you simply let everything go through you. See, if Mary had been under the cross saying, you're all wicked, evil, terrible people, so on, what's she doing? She's taking it all, the darkness, and just giving it back. No, she pondered. She takes it in. She holds it until she can do. And Jesus, only Mary and Jesus get this right in the New Testament. They take it in, and they don't act like an electrical wire. They act like a water filter. A water filter brings in water with many impurities. It holds the impurities and keeps them inside of itself and gives back only the pure water. So you see it with Jesus. Jesus took in hatred, held it, and he gave back love. He took in curses, and he held the curses and gave back blessing. He took in bitterness, he held that, and he gave back graciousness. He took in murder, and he held the murder and gave back forgiveness. See, that's what it means to ponder. Our task as adult Christians is to carry this tension. And sometimes, I got in a lot of trouble the other night when I said this, but I'll say it again. Sometimes say, what can you say about this thing? Sometimes nothing. Nothing. It's the same as some of you are parents, and you have a kid who's 21 years old who's standing in front of you and says, I don't want to go to church anymore. I don't want to believe your religion. I'm fed up with it. You know what you can say a lot of times? Nothing. And nothing can be enough. You hold their tension. You carry their tension until the time comes. Like I think it's very important that ad intra we have this kind of conversation inside the Christian community. Right now, personally, I don't think there's a lot we can say to the secular world that isn't going to be defensive, that isn't going to be self-serving, that isn't going to be more harmful, that isn't going to give back in kind. Say, well, you vicious journalists, sitting in the front row, you're reporting all this stuff, and where's your Catholicism and so on. That's Mary trying to stop the crucifixion, saying, you wicked men, get off my son, No, sometimes all you can do is ponder, and you're doing a lot. In fact, that's the hardest thing to do of all. Sometimes just to silently do nothing. If you want to see a wonderful, wonderful example of secular pondering, rent and watch the video, Jane Austen's piece, Sense and Sensibility. Remember this woman? She has to go through several years, and she has to carry this incredible tension, which is very unfair. What can she say or do? Nothing. But you see, when it's resolved, she saves the family by doing that, and also it's truly sublime. She does a sublime thing. She does something great. Anybody can let tension flow through them. Someone comes up, pops you on the nose, just hit back even harder. If you're big enough, you can do that. It doesn't solve anything. It's the old song, the old tape, again and again and again. We're asked to sing a new song. And part of that we get directly from Mary and Christ. And that is, you carry the tension. And people say, well, the church is scandalous, and the bishops are this, and that's wrong, and you're wrong, and this is wrong, and what can you say? Nothing. I think it's important we have this kind of conversation, but I told the group the other night, if CNN would phone me and say, can we interview you in this? I'd say, no, I have nothing to say. I'll speak to Catholic groups like this one, because this is an ad intra, this is a family conversation inside the intimacy of family walls. But there's nothing I can say right now to CNN that's going to change anything. That's not going to be defensive, self-serving. And I could go on and be very self-serving, say like, This is not fair to me. I'm not a pedophile, and I walk in an airport, I have a collar on, people are staring at me, and I can't hug people's kids, and people are suspicious. It's also unfair. It's nonsense. It's self-serving, and people will see through that, and they do see through it. You know, they say, Father, get a life. You know, grow up. You know, when Jesus was on the cross, he wasn't protesting. He didn't say, I'm innocent, and the other two people are guilty. You know, he ate it, as they say in Texas. He simply ate the humiliation. He ate it for the community. He ate it for the world. I'm not sure if you're getting this, but I need to stop, and it's because we need to have some questions and so on. But that's the perspective. It's a risk to throw it like this, but I throw it out to you, and I take some. We have 20 minutes, so we have some questions, reactions, and so on. Go ahead.
You referred to pedophilia in the priesthood as an illness whose etiology could often be traced to some traumatic event that the priest had earlier in life where he was a victim. To what extent could perhaps the priest be a victim of the culture of the priesthood in the context of today's society?
Okay, very good question. I'll repeat the question. Like I said, in pedophilia, whether it's a priest or anybody else, it's some massive trauma. They themselves were victimized in some massive way as a child, which is really the root of the illness. So our question is, to what extent might a priest be a victim of, well, the culture of priesthood, for lack of a better word, and so on? That question has been very debated in the papers. With good insights, and I think sometimes ideological insights, which are using it as a springboard to make an ideological point. I think in all vocations, there are mammoth and massive dangers, particularly in celibacy. Okay, see, celibacy is a very dangerous vocation, which doesn't mean it can't be a very good vocation. I quote famous German poet Goethe. Goethe says, the dangers of life are many, and safety is one of those dangers. Okay, that's a good quote. The dangers of life are many, and safety is a major danger. Celibacy is dangerous. Now, dangerous, but ironically, I don't think in ways that the press has jumped on lately. Priests don't become pedophiles. Some pedophiles become priests, but you don't become. You don't, remember I said the roots of the disease are when you're a kid, when you're a child. A priest doesn't become a pedophile. Pedophilia of itself is not triggered by celibacy. And it's no higher statistically among celibates than among married people or anybody else. There are real dangers of celibacy in terms that can compound it. See, there's primary cause and secondary cause. Sometimes if a priest celibate is not well grounded and he hasn't got support, as a pedophile, he may act out more because there isn't, sometimes we're carrying a disease, and it's when we're overtired or something else happens that it short circuits. That can happen. But it also happens to married people or other people. I think the dangers of celibacy are much more subtle and also need to be enunciated in a major kind of way. Bluntly put, I personally feel it takes us beyond this conversation. The biggest danger of celibacy is not pedophilia, it's selfishness. See, in marriage, the dynamics of the relationship itself, and that's why the natural way to be in life is to be married. You learn that on the second page of Scripture. It is not good for the man to be alone, or the woman, or anybody else. It's not even good for atoms to be alone. They're joined, The universe works in couplets and in pairs and so on, but that isn't just for emotional and sexual, union, which is wonderful, but it's also, there's an inbuilt thing in nature that starts with a married relationship and then goes with children and so on, which forces people to grow up. See, the advantage married people have over me is you have maturity by conscription, especially if you have kids. You don't have a choice, and they're going to raise you and make you adults whether you want to or not, unless you're really a bad piece of work. Some people can avoid it, See, whereas a priest or a sister, we can we can withdraw. It gets. I mean, we also have inbuilt things that should do that to us. But you don't have kids, and you don't have a married partner. So I mean, I look at my own life. I can go through years, for instance, of workaholism, and nobody calls me. Not only do they call me, I get admired for it. Sometimes the sicker I get, the more adulation I get. And people say, isn't he such a wonderful guy? He's all over the world giving all these talks, you know. Well, I had a wife, she'd say, one more weekend gone and you're divorced, you know. See your kids and so on. If you have kids, like you have 25 or 30 years, they might be 35 years, you know, the way kids are leaving home later. Where simply your life is not your own. Your car keys, your money, your time, your energy, your emotions, everything is just stripped from you all the time. You turn around, there's two hands who want something. When you get 30 years of practice, a lot of married people, they end up growing up. You know, that between you and I, that's the biggest danger of celibacy. The biggest danger is not that some poor celibate's going to go over the deep end and have an affair or something. That happens. It's not the deepest danger. The deepest danger is much more subtle, which again doesn't mean it can't be a great and a powerful and an important vocation. But I really believe that the issue of celibacy in the church, which is an important one, should be argued separately from this issue. You know, for the benefit of both. For the benefit of celibacy, but also to not fudge the issue of what's at issue here. The deep issue is not, this is not about us. This is not about the church. It's about the one out of every 4 or 5 kids whose life is being violated and partly destroyed or sometimes totally destroyed before they have access to their own life. That's what this is about, you know. And to get it, see, the danger is with some of our ecclesial is we sidetrack that and we make it a narcissistic issue inside of ecclesiology. Well, I want to hang a cardinal, I want to do this, and so on. Those are all valid enough. It's a different issue. Hang your cardinal for other reasons, or your bishop, or whoever. You know, I'm not talking about yours anywhere. You know, see, we do have valid things to fight with our cardinals and bishops, and celibacy well may be one of them. I would much prefer to have it divorced from this issue, so that that's fought on its own grounds. And on deeper grounds, like I just mentioned some of the deeper grounds, you know, but also that we don't lose sight that this is, I always quote Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr said, this is not about us. You know, so many things, this is not about me as a priest. You know, even though I might be on the front pages, you know, tomorrow, or who knows when somebody will make an accusation or whatever, and so on. And I won't much enjoy it. I can deny it already, it's not true, but if somebody puts it up there, it's there, and my life can be destroyed. You know, so I don't say these things lightly, but in the end, this is not about me or the priesthood or the bishops. Remember, because Jesus says, my life is not about the church. My life is about the world. My flesh is food for the life of the world. And causes inside of the church are important. This is not a cause inside of the church. This is a cause inside of the world, and something the church is being asked to do something for the world for. Other questions?
Is there any relationship, or do you see any relationship between pornography and pedophilia then?
Again, good question. Do I see a relationship between pornography and pedophilia? In the tangentially and secondary cause, maybe yes. As a primary thing, no. People also don't become pedophiles by watching pornography. Some pedophiles stimulate themselves by watching pornography. Just, you know, it's important to get that order. See, nobody watches pornography and becomes a pedophile. A pedophile might watch pornography and stimulate himself or herself to act out. The same as priests don't become pedophiles. Some pedophiles become priests. Sorry, that sounds a lot like a soundbite, and it is, but it's more than that. You unpackage that, see, so that pornography will never be the primary cause of pedophilia. You know, it's got to be some deep trauma when you're a child. And that's right within the anatomy of the illness itself. The illness doesn't work otherwise. Okay.
Why do we see less published incidents or reportings of female pedophiles than male pedophiles?
It's a good question. Why do we see less reported instances of female pedophilia than male pedophilia? I honestly don't know, and we don't have the exact stats on that. Talk to psychiatrists privately and so on. There is more than reaching. I don't know. I'm not necessarily suggesting it's 50-50, but there's a fair amount of it around, and you know, more recently it is making the papers. So the teacher in Seattle, or there's been teachers here, and so on. I think up until recently, and this was part of the reverse of our double standard. See, we had we'll never have a whole healthy view of sexuality, but we're getting better, okay. But we had a double standard where men and women. So for a while, female pedophilia, especially with the kid was considered kind of the lucky guy. That was kind of the reverse of our double standard. Now we're realizing this is really a crime, and it devastates the boy in the same way as a girl is devastated through. Is it reported less? We don't know. Is it simply, does it exist less? I don't have the numbers. I don't know. I don't think it is 50-50, but it's not just a male disease.
One of the things I find interesting is the fact that when you read the incidents about the women in the teacher from Britain and the situation in Seattle is that, well, certainly didn't she have bad judgment versus the response that would have been had it been men.
See, we're still, as a culture, to put this on what should be a level of a culture, that's where discussion has to ultimately take place. And eventually it'll get there. Eventually it gets out into the public forum where it should be and so on. We need to talk about that. And I think we need to take more seriously the whole issue of sexuality. We're starting. By and large, as painful as it is, all the focus we've done on pedophilia and child molestation and so on has been a really good thing for this culture. We're hundreds of years too late, but at least we're starting. Some cultures haven't started, and now we're seeing the devastation. We're taking seriously what a violation of sexually of a child does to the child. Now we're going to have to crank that up a few years and say, what about the kid who's sexually active at 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, especially with somebody who's older and a teacher or something? What about that? And what's it doing to their soul? And we also have to start having a little more courage to look at that than we've looked at lately, in both communities, the conservative community and the liberal community. There's a powerful naivete about sexuality. There always has been, but today the danger is we think there isn't. I'll quote Jung. Carl Jung said, naivete about spiritual energy, and especially about sexual energy, is the greatest naivete in the Western world. See, we think energy is friendly, and it's not. It's not at all, And so, for instance, somebody asked a question about pornography. Let me talk about that. What's wrong with pornography? Like, I have liberal friends who will argue, they say, what's wrong with that? It's just that we're uptight about sex. And people making love is the most beautiful thing on the earth. You can't argue about that. It's true. Except there's a tremendous naivete, You begin with Scripture, where Scripture says, nobody can see God and live. Unpackage that line, and you'll find out what's wrong with pornography. Pornography isn't bad because it's dirty or something, because the energy is too powerful. It's not meant to be watched. Put it archetypally, you are not meant to watch Aphrodite and Eros making love under a tree. If you do, the fire it creates in you is too much, and you have a choice between acting it out or going into an adaptive depression. And it's usually the latter that'll happen, So pornography is one of the great depressants in the culture, and some liberal ideology notwithstanding, Jung would say it's nonsense. You can't watch pornography, Scripture just has its own way of putting it. Scripture says nobody can look at God and live. They weren't just saying about seeing a Yahweh in heaven. See, energy needs filters. That's also what cults haven't understood. You know what's wrong with cults? David Koresh and so on. It's not that they aren't real. They are. They're massively real, and that's why they destroy people. They try to mainline spiritual energy without filters, and you get fried to death, usually literally. one of the things that the great religions, like Christianity, bring on the scene, they say, we'll connect you with God and we'll disconnect you enough at the same time that you don't burn up. It's the same with sexual energy. Of course we were repressed and uptight and everything about sex in the past. I'm not sure we've achieved very much. And when you look at the trail of broken hearts and suicides and everything else, we're a lot more free, but I'm not sure we're a lot more happy either. I'm not to say we should stay where we stayed, but we're not exactly making great psychological and moral strides in the area of sexuality. We're making some strides. Okay.
I mentioned Renee Girard earlier, and your use of the word scapegoat here. That energy you're talking about, can you sort of make some connection to that and violence and the scapegoating notion that Girard sort of worked with? Is that part of, is violence part of this energy that is part of us, or a capacity that is part of this larger culture?
Very much so. She asked a question about the scapegoat, and I mentioned Renee Girard, and I've written here about being a scapegoat. Let me start with this. Christianity, we're very unique among all the religions and cultures of the world. And quoting Renee Girard, he'd say, we're so used to it after 2,000 years, we don't even realize what an incredibly radical thing it is. We're the only religion that worships the scapegoat. See, we have Jesus on a cross. We worship the loser. We worship the excluded one. We worship the one who's been thrown out of the community and killed by the community. And that's the scapegoat. Now, let's talk about scapegoats. See, a scapegoat, we form community around scapegoating until we reach a certain level of maturity, and oftentimes we never get there. Inside of a family, in a staff room, in a friendship group, we only have community when we're at a certain level of maturity. Only when we reach that can we give up using scapegoats. Let me give you a simple example. 5 of us can go out for a dinner, okay? And if we're going to have any kind of conversation, especially people not just you meet 5 people you've never met before, but imagine 5 of your colleagues, you go out for dinner, and there's immense differences between you, and that's understandable, and all kinds of tensions between you. And you can have a wonderful dinner on what basis? You're talking about somebody else who isn't there. And of course, you're afraid to go to the bathroom, okay, because as soon as you go, they're going to be talking about you. Did you see what she's wearing and all this, or how bad his book is and all this stuff? See, so we create community by ostracizing somebody, and see, that person takes the tension out of us. So we're 6 people who, if the truth were known, would like to hit each other, but we can have a wonderful dinner by scapegoating Margie, who isn't there. And God, she's nuttier than a fruitcake, and then this, and that's the anthropological function of gossip, and it works wonderfully, So Margie is actually the lamb who's taking away the sin of these 6 people, because she's not around, and we do that communally. One of the big struggles right now with the United States, I can say this, I'm safe far enough from the border, is since the communist regime fell in Moscow, there's not enough of an enemy, Remember, for years we defined ourselves about who we're against. And so often, religious and fundamentalists and so on, it's to define yourself. Who am I against? What are my boundaries? See, somebody has to be scapegoated for me to draw life. Jesus just played that motif in. Jesus became our scapegoat, except Jesus took the sin out of the community, not by going out in the desert and dying like the scapegoats do, but precisely by acting as his water filter. See, Jesus took in the gossip, and he didn't give it back. He held it, and he gave back the graciousness. That's also the René Girard gave us the language and the articulation of this. You can read his works are popularized in a wonderful book by a California anthropologist, theologian called Gil Bailey, called Violence Unveiled. And Bailey also shows the linkage between violence and scapegoating and why it's always there and so on. Incidentally, that book, the publisher at Crossroads told us that they considered it the most important, significant book they've published in 50 years, called Violence Unveiled. It's basically a popularization of Girard's work on the scapegoat. And But it shows how, but what Gerard showed is that our consciousness and the consciousness of the world, not just the Western world, has already been very much shaped by the cross. So that the cross has already done a massive work in history in terms of shaping our consciousness, that there is a lot of sympathy naturally towards the scapegoat. So I'll give you an example. When you read the text in John's Gospel where the woman's caught in adultery, and they bring her there and they say to Jesus, should we stone her? Because Moses said if you're caught in adultery, you should stone her. Who do you feel sorry for when you read that text? The woman, because you realize this is a group. See, they're scapegoating her. See, already that's the cross. That's the work of the cross for 2,000 years. You already know these people should get a life. They're trying to make themselves happy by putting this woman to death, and it's not going to work. The scapegoat. And see, that oftentimes all scapegoating is a certain form of violence. One last question.
What about trafficking of the girl child? For sexual exploitation. Is it pedophiles who use it?
What about trafficking of the girl child? Well, it depends on the age of the child. If the child is pre-puberty, most of the trafficking in women is more in the line of prostitution. It still is exploitation because oftentimes they're minors, but there's not so much sexual abuse, sexual pedophilia there. It's simply a terribly, horribly moral and otherwise using of a person, It's a form of violent prostitution that, I would imagine there is some traffic in children, and then there is children pornography and so on, and that is certainly that. Okay, you're going to get the last word on the back.
While clericalism may not encourage pedophiles, is there anything about clerical culture as it stands that attracts pedophiles to that?
Very interesting question. While clericalism doesn't encourage, necessarily cause pedophilia, might clerical culture attract the pedophile? The studies are still, it's premature. I would suspect, and I can say that because I'm not a person to bash clerical culture. It has its faults, it has its strengths. Probably yes. And not because it's evil. I think there's something endemic because it's celibate, it's men, it can be like a kind of a safe haven. And also it's interesting to see we still need studies of the psyche of the pedophile. And the ones I've known, oftentimes, they can be very sensitive people, the same as many sick people can be very sensitive. And so sometimes, ironically, they're even attracted to the priesthood for the right reasons, so that you're not dealing with somebody who's completely duplicitous and so on. Illness doesn't work that way. You're not dealing with, this is not psychopath. A psychopath is somebody who's completely and utterly schizophrenically duplicitous. That's not what you have here. You have a sick person who can act out healthily, who can fool a lot of people, who can go through screening boards, who can fool psychiatrists, who can pass lie detector tests, and who isn't even doing it because they're malicious. They're doing it because they're sick, and their own wound is buried so deep. That's what makes it tough. But I think there's something to your question. I don't have numbers, but my hunch would be, and it's not that necessarily something wrong then with clerical culture, but given the nature of the illness and who's acting out, this can be quite an attractive place for somebody to find a haven. Thank you.
Before I ask President Dr. Michael Higgins to come to the podium for a few minutes to offer a formal thank you for a stimulating evening, just a few comments. First of all, as usual, there is coffee at the back and there are cookies at the back, and Father Ron has agreed to stick around for a while, have a coffee, brace himself for the snowy ride back to Toronto, and to sign some books. So Chuck Arian is back there from Wordsworth with a number of Father Ron's books, and I think I even saw a copy of Power and Peril, or whatever it's called, back there. In case there's anyone who hasn't bought a copy. Okay, I said it, Michael. A few comments. I want to thank Joe Sinisek for a really thoughtful introduction and for his kind words about the series. We're delighted that the Catholic Register is part of what we do here. As usual, at the back there is fair trade coffee, organic coffee, chocolate tea, and we are pleased to support Just Cause, and we invite you to buy their products at the back. If you are not on our mailing list, there are forms at the back, and we would encourage you to become a member of our mailing list. You will get our brochure on an annual basis. You will get email reminders about upcoming events, and so take the opportunity, please. Also, if you'd like to order a copy of tonight's talk or any other talk, they are all on tape, and they're available for $10, which is essentially our cost. There are forms at the back to purchase those. And again, I want to thank Carol Person for all the work she's done to help organize this evening's event. And her husband, Ivan, who works industriously at the back, tapes the events. And also Melinda De Silva, who helped us by distributing materials at the back this evening. You also will have received your copy of the brochure, and you will know that on the back we talk about the Friends of the Center. You will be aware that we do have all of our talks really endowed, but you also know that returns on investments are not very good these days. We really want this to remain a free service, and as Joe stressed, it's important that we provide it. We do want it to be free, and we don't want anyone to feel any kind of compulsion to contribute. But when you are thinking of charities where you might write a check, think of us. And any donation is tax deductible. And, it's something that will be there permanently. Think of putting us in your will, in fact, would be a nice thing to do. We need all of us to think ahead. Michael's laughing, but he's also applauding. The next center event will be 3 weeks from tonight, when Dr. Nuala Kenny will present the first John Sweeney Lecture in Catholic Healthcare. Her topic is Justice and Compassion in Canadian Health Reform. She's been intimately involved in issues related to healthcare, and she will bring a lot of experience and I'm sure some real insight to that discussion. The following day, the Challenge for Change will continue the weekend of discussions on healthcare and social justice. Their event is entitled Justice and Compassion to Heal the World. That event will take place the following day, Saturday, November 23rd, from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, 49 Queen Street North in Kitchener. If you'd like to register for the event, the detail is at the back, and Carol Person would be pleased to help you with that. And to close the event then, I would welcome Dr. President Michael Higgins to provide a formal thank you. And after Michael's thank you, please mill at the back and chat with one another and take the opportunity to say hello to Father Ron. Michael?